I never thought the breaking point would come with a coffee machine. 20 years of running operations, holding the company together with binders, spreadsheets, and late nights. And there I was, crouched in the corner of the break room, prying dried Colombian roast out of a plastic pipe like some underpaid handyman, not because it was my job. God. No. But because the new HR girl, whose greatest achievement so far had been accidentally CCing her Chipotle lunch order to the entire company, couldn't figure out how to unclog a K-cup chute. And before I take you deeper into what happened next, let me pause for just a second to check in with you. How are you doing today? Have you had your coffee yet? Or maybe tea if that's your thing. Tell me where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, a quick tap on that like button or hitting subscribe makes a world of difference. All right, let's get back to that break room. Because that one small moment with a coffee machine was the first crack in a much bigger story. I was still in the same gray blazer I'd worn for years, one of those $30 specials that never quite fit right, but looked respectable enough. My knees ached as I worked, but I kept at it. That was who I had always been, the one who fixed things, quietly and without complaint. The one people turned to when the system jammed, the contract didn't balance, or the process threatened to collapse. I had been there since the company was 4 desks shoved into a strip mall next to a shuttered laser tag arena. Back then, I did everything: payroll, vendor contracts, onboarding new hires, while making sure the lights stayed on and the rent got paid. That history didn't matter to Gavin Thorne, the new CEO, fresh from some business school echo chamber, strolled past me with his Bluetooth headset dangling like a badge of importance. He looked me up and down as if I were invisible, then muttered under his breath, "Can't facilities handle that?" The words weren't directed to me. Not really. They were tossed out like cigarette ash, casual and cutting. I didn't look up. I didn't answer. If I had, I might have flung the entire coffee pod at the patch of beard he thought made him look sophisticated. Instead, I swallowed the sting, pressed the plastic pipe back into place, and let the humiliation settle in my chest like heavy sludge. Gavin strutted on, slick hair, slicker shoes, the embodiment of confidence without substance. And me? I stayed on the floor, silent, steady, pretending not to notice the way the balance of power had shifted. I didn't know it then, but that offhand remark, those 5 careless words, were the first crack in the dam. The quiet humiliation I absorbed that morning would be the very thing that set everything else in motion. When I think back on the early years, it almost feels like a different lifetime. Long before sleek offices and glossy press releases, we were crammed into a rented space in a strip mall wedged between a failing nail salon and a shuttered laser tag arena. The carpet smelled faintly of mildew, the walls were beige and peeling, and the heating system rattled like an old truck engine every time it kicked on. But for me, that little box of a building was everything. It was possibility. It was purpose. It was family. At least for a while. I wore more hats than anyone should reasonably wear in a day. Operations manager, payroll clerk, HR rep, vendor negotiator, I played them all. In the mornings, I'd be making sure the coffee arrived on time and the printers didn't jam. By lunch, I'd be reviewing vendor contracts and chasing down late invoices. By evening, I was onboarding new hires, walking them through forms and software like they were my own kids heading off to school. Every detail mattered, because if one piece fell through the cracks, the whole fragile structure could collapse. I didn't complain. I was proud of the work, proud that I could take something so small and keep it breathing long enough to grow. In 2002, after one especially brutal quarter, when I pulled payroll together single-handedly to avoid missing checks, the founders handed me a folder. Inside were stock option certificates, 50,000 shares of a company that most people thought would be dead within a year. They called it a token of gratitude, a way to say, You've been here from the start, and we see you. I remember running my thumb over the cheap ballpoint signatures, the paper already beginning to yellow at the edges. Most of the early team laughed them off. Some cashed out as soon as the market gave them a chance, trading their paper for down payments or student loan relief. Who could blame them? None of us thought those slips would ever mean much. Me, though, I tucked mine into a fireproof box I kept in my hall closet. The same box that held my expired passport and my ex-husband's old dental records. Out of sight, out of mind. Not because I was some visionary investor. Truthfully, I just forgot about them most days. Years rolled by, and those shares faded into the background of my life. They were never a bargaining chip in meetings, never a reason to brag. They were just there, quiet, unremarkable, gathering dust like the old staplers we never threw away. But sometimes, when I opened that fireproof box to stash tax returns or old photographs, I'd glance at them and feel a flicker of pride. Proof that I had been there when the company was fragile, when no one believed it could last. Proof that I mattered. I didn't realize it then, but what looked like scrap paper to most people was something else entirely. The shares weren't just sentimental leftovers from a bygone era. They were a fuse waiting to be lit. What the CEO later called worthless would become the single piece of paper that determined his fate. And mine. There's a particular kind of loneliness that sets in when you're erased while still sitting at your desk. I felt it creeping up on me in small humiliations, the kind that don't leave bruises but cut deeper than you'd expect. Gavin never once used my name correctly. The first week. I was Laura. The next. Linda? Then. Eventually. Nothing at all, just a wave of his hand when something broke. Like I was a service bell he could ring without thought, each time he brushed past me. I swallowed the correction. What was the point? The CEO sets the tone. And his tone made one thing clear. I was furniture. The meetings were harder to ignore. I had built the vendor workflow back in 2013, the one that cut processing times nearly in half and saved the company hundreds of thousands a year. That system kept entire departments afloat. But when Gavin unveiled it in a quarterly presentation, my name was nowhere. His slides were polished, the fonts modern, and every bullet point landed with the confidence of a man borrowing someone else's brilliance. My work, my late nights, my problem-solving, all reduced to a soundbite under his smirk. People clapped. I stayed quiet, clapping too, because that's what survival looked like. Then came the morning when my erasure became official. I was sipping stale coffee at my desk when the company newsletter pinged into my inbox. Strategic Evolution, Preparing for Our Next Chapter. That was the headline. The body of the article buzzed with PR language. Innovation, synergy, unlocking new horizons. The words blurred, but the number cut through. $150 million merger in the works. A deal that would reshape everything. I scrolled. Scanning for my name. Nothing. I searched the fine print. Nothing. Just a single, cold sentence buried halfway down the page. Operational responsibilities previously held by Lucina Hayes will be consolidated under the incoming COO. No thank you, no acknowledgement, just a neat line, striking me out like I had never existed. I sat there, the chatter of the office around me muffled like someone had stuffed cotton in my ears. My hands shook slightly, though I pressed them flat against the desk to hide it. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger burns hot and bright. What I felt was heavier, a quiet, suffocating weight pressing into my chest. 20 years, reduced to one sentence in a newsletter. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was still breathing, still working, still showing up every day. But on paper, I was already gone. Gavin had killed my career in silence. On a document most employees would skim and delete. I wasn't terminated, not officially, but in every way that mattered. I had already been erased. That was the twist I hadn't expected. You can die on the page long before anyone tells you you're dead. And I realized, sitting there with stale coffee in hand, that my fight for survival had already begun. The invitation hit my inbox at 4:58 p.m. On a Friday, no agenda, no subject line beyond quick alignment chat. Everyone in corporate knows what that means. I almost didn't go. I could have walked straight to the parking garage, driven home, and let them stew in their own pretense. But after 20 years of showing up, through snowstorms, flu seasons, and server meltdowns, I still had the reflex, the good soldier twitch. So I walked into conference room B. Gavin was already there, lounging back like a villain in a second-rate drama. Tie loosened just enough to suggest casual confidence. Across the table sat Jenna from HR, clutching a manila folder as though it contained radioactive material. She smiled with that brittle, overly rehearsed expression HR people practice in mirrors. I didn't sit. Gavin gestured like he was doing me a favor. "Lucina," he said, mispronouncing it again, dragging the vowels like he had all the time in the world. "We really appreciate everything you've done for the company. 2 decades. That's a hell of a run." Jenna slid the folder toward me, her hand trembling slightly. Inside was the boilerplate, a termination letter, an NDA, a severance package breakdown, even the obligatory Cobra pamphlet, but tucked between the pages, folded in as if it belonged, was a waiver, a shareholder rights waiver. I picked it up. My pulse quickened, but I kept my face neutral. Gavin leaned forward, smirking, his tone syrupy. "Those 50,000 shares?" He gave a small laugh. "Wouldn't buy you lunch after the merger closes. We're doing you a favor by cashing you out at all. Sign it, and you can walk away clean." He expected outrage. He expected tears or bargaining, instead. I let the silence expand until it became its own kind of pressure. My eyes scanned the document, tracing the dense legal jargon. There it was, an unusual clause, buried deep enough that most people would skim past it. Not casual, not symbolic. Something they wanted badly, dressed up to look like routine paperwork. I set the pen down neatly on the table. "This isn't standard," I said quietly. My voice was flat, steady, the kind of tone I had once used to renegotiate vendor contracts when the other side thought they could corner me. "Legal insists," Gavin replied with a shrug. "Clean exits make for clean transitions." He smiled. Wolfish. "It's just a formality. Nothing to lose sleep over." I closed the folder, slid it back across the table. "I'll need time to review. With counsel." Jenna's smile cracked like glass. Gavin's eyes flicked sideways, searching for a teleprompter that wasn't there. He cleared his throat. "You're not disputing the terms, are you?" "I'm not discussing them at all," I answered. Then I stood, adjusted my blazer, and walked out without looking back. No tears, no raised voice, just exit, stage left. By the time I hit the parking garage, the numbness had burned off, replaced by something sharper. Suspicion, instinct. Because when a man like Gavin says something is just symbolic, it's never symbolic. It's critical. And now I knew exactly where to start digging. When I got home that night, I didn't reach for a glass of wine or collapse onto the couch like part of me wanted to. Instead, I went straight to the hall closet. The fireproof box had sat there for years, wedged between old tax folders and a broken umbrella. The clasp stuck the way it always did, squealing like a protest as I pried it open. Inside lay the artifacts of a career that had consumed most of my adult life: yellowing stock certificates, paper memos, and printouts from an era when cloud storage was still a joke about the weather. I pulled everything out, spreading the papers across my dining table. Dust clung to my fingers. There were the original certificates from 2002, 50,000 shares in neat block lettering, signed with the cheap ink of founders who probably didn't believe the company would survive its first year. There were copies of board minutes, policy revisions, vendor contracts, all the receipts I had kept because something in me always whispered that documentation was a quiet woman's armor. Then my eyes landed on a folder marked Q2 2006. Board Addendum. My stomach tightened as I flipped it open. The amendment spelled out protections for minority shareholders, veto authority if their combined voting block crossed a set threshold. I remembered that meeting. The CFO back then had pushed for it, terrified of hostile takeovers. At the time, I barely listened. I was too busy running payroll and explaining to a new hire how to log into the system. But the clause was real, signed, notarized, and never revoked. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. Gavin's waiver wasn't random legal fluff. He wanted me to sign away rights that still mattered, rights that could stop his precious merger dead in its tracks. Suspicion that had been gnawing at me since the conference room now solidified into clarity. He hadn't underestimated me by accident. He had tried to erase me before I realized what I held. As I shuffled the stack, a card slipped loose. A birthday card. My son's 7th. The year I missed his party because I was stuck at the office managing a system crash. His crooked handwriting scrawled, "Happy birthday, Mom! We saved you cake." My throat tightened. The sacrifices weren't abstract. They were right there. Ink on paper. Little reminders of what I had given up while keeping the company alive. For the first time in days. Anger gave way to something steadier. Determination. I took out a notepad. Scribbling numbers, dilution percentages, expiring proxies. The early employees who had sold or walked away. The math was brutal, but the answer was clear. My 50,000 shares weren't dust. They were enough. Enough to qualify as a blocker. Enough to veto any merger Gavin tried to push through. I stared at the table, papers scattered like battle plans, and felt something shift inside me. I wasn't powerless, not anymore. What Gavin dismissed as worthless was the very thing that could bring his empire to a halt. The first email came Monday morning at 9:03 a.m., bright and cheery, as if it were offering me a coupon code instead of marching orders. Gentle reminder, please finalize your exit paperwork to ensure a smooth transition. Attached was the same waiver I had already refused to sign in person. I deleted it without a second thought. By 11. Another email landed, this time from someone in legal I'd never met. A man named Jason with a Y, which felt on brand. His message was longer, dripping with formality, warning that delays could complicate pending corporate actions and hinting at unfavorable consequences. Translation, sign the damn paper, or we'll make it messy. I didn't bother replying. Silence was my reply. On Tuesday, the tone escalated. My phone lit up with Gavin's name as I was microwaving leftover pasta. For a moment. I considered letting it ring, but curiosity won. I wanted to hear what desperation sounded like, wrapped in arrogance. "Lucina!" he began. Too bright, too cheerful, like a salesman overcompensating for a dying pitch. "Just wanted to check in. Thought maybe there was confusion with the documents." "No confusion," I said, stabbing at my pasta. A pause. His voice dropped a notch. "Look, transitions are hard, but dragging this out helps no one, especially you. Those shares don't mean anything anymore. Not in this market. Not after the merger." I let the silence hang, stretching it until I could almost feel his grip tighten on the phone. Men like Gavin hate silence. It makes them sweat. Finally, I said 5 words, steady and cool. "We'll see about that." Then I ended the call. A text buzzed through seconds later. "Let's be adults about this. Don't ruin a good legacy with stubbornness." I blocked the number. By Wednesday, the smear campaign had started. Screenshots trickled in from former colleagues, Slack threads questioning what I even did all day, whispers about performance misalignment, which is HR code for we needed her gone and couldn't be bothered to invent a better excuse. I didn't respond. Not publicly, not privately. Every word they threw into the air would eventually boomerang back at them. Then, late that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. A message, not from HR, not from legal, but from an old colleague I hadn't spoken to in years. "I know they're treating you unfairly. Don't give up. You're stronger than they realize." I sat staring at the words longer than I expected. The office chatter, the fake smiles, the endless sacrifices. They had all made me forget what loyalty once felt like. For a moment, warmth cut through the ice, not enough to melt my resolve, but enough to remind me I wasn't entirely alone. So I stayed silent, cold, deliberate, unshakable, because silence, in the right hands, isn't weakness, it's control. And Gavin had no idea how much power I still held simply by refusing to play his game. By Thursday morning, I knew I needed backup. Not another sympathetic text from an old colleague. Not the hollow words of HR emails. I needed someone who could stare down Gavin and his lawyers without blinking. That's how I found myself sitting in a beige office above a dry cleaner, across from a woman named Nina Rourke. Her office smelled faintly of old wood and sharper still of quiet vengeance. The shelves were lined not with diplomas or motivational quotes, but with thick binders, neatly labeled, like trophies from past battles. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, sharper-tongued, with the kind of presence that made even silence feel dangerous. I handed her the manila folder Gavin had slid across the table days earlier. She flipped through the pages with a speed that told me she'd done this 1,000 times before. Termination letter, NDA, severance packet. Then the waiver. The waiver. Her eyes narrowed, then relaxed. She set the papers down and leaned back in her chair. "They're screwed," she said simply. I blinked. That was it. No theatrics, no disclaimers. Just 2 words spoken with the certainty of someone who had already mapped out the ending before the story had finished. For the first time in weeks, I felt air return to my lungs. She tapped the waiver with one manicured nail. "This isn't a formality. This is desperation. They need you out of the way before that merger clears. Without your signature, they're hanging by a thread." I nodded, my fingers tightening around the armrest. "So what do we do?" Nina smiled faintly, the kind of smile that made you glad she was on your side. "Nothing." I must have looked confused because she leaned forward, steepling her fingers. "You don't chase them. You don't email back. You don't call. You let them panic. The more they scramble, the deeper the cracks in their story. Silence will do more damage than shouting ever could." Her words settled over me like armor. For so long, silence had been my cage, what they used against me to erase me, to make me invisible. But now, in Nina's hands, silence was a weapon, and it was mine to wield. I thought of Gavin pacing his glass office, of HR drafting another gentle reminder, of legal sweating over spreadsheets they hadn't touched in years, all of them waiting for me to blink, to fold, to disappear quietly. But this time, my silence would be deliberate, controlled, deadly. Nina gathered the folder back into a neat stack and handed it to me. "Do nothing unless I tell you. Let them light their own fuse, and when the explosion comes, we'll be the ones standing." I walked out of her office taller than I'd walked in. For the first time since Gavin had called my shares worthless. I didn't feel erased. I felt powerful. Their panic would be my proof, and my silence would be the loudest answer of all. By the following Thursday, I didn't need to lift a finger. The cracks were already spreading on their own, somewhere in the bowels of the acquiring firm. A junior associate was buried under spreadsheets, combing through the shareholder ledger like it was her final exam. Her job was thankless, tedious, cross-referencing proxies, verifying percentages, making sure every consent lined up, 99 times out of 100. It was a rubber stamp exercise, but this time, she stumbled across my name. Lucina Hayes, Class A shareholder, legacy vesting privileges, no proxy on file, no waiver signed. It was the kind of discovery that makes young lawyers sweat and partners lose sleep. By 11:15 a.m., she had flagged it to her supervisor. By 3 p.m., there was an emergency conference call with Gavin, the CFO, their internal counsel, and a very expensive man from outside legal who probably billed by the breath. I wasn't in the room, but I can picture it. Gavin brushing it off with that fake laugh he used at company mixers. Oh, Dana, Lucina, she's old guard. She's been off-boarded. Her shares are dust. We have her exit paperwork. It's just not processed yet. But then came the reply that made me wish I could have seen his face. The acquiring firm's senior lawyer cut in. Voice flat, precise. I'm looking at the documents right now. There's no signed waiver, no proxy, nothing revoking her rights. Silence. Heavy and awkward. Must have hung over the line. I imagined the CFO's water bottle pausing halfway to his lips. The internal counsel frantically flipping through notes, like maybe reality had shifted on the page. Gavin tried again. Tighter this time. She won't use it. She's not that type. She was always quiet, embarrassed. Really, no leverage, just grievances. That was the moment I almost laughed out loud in my kitchen. Because he wasn't entirely wrong. I had been quiet. But now my silence was deliberate. And it terrified him. The acquiring firm's lawyer didn't soften. Whether she uses it or not is irrelevant. The fact is, your entire deal memo assumes unanimous legacy consent, and you don't have it. There it was. Clean, clinical, undeniable. My veto. Sitting in plain sight like a live wire Gavin thought he'd buried. And the best part? I hadn't done a thing. They had tripped over their own arrogance and exposed the truth themselves. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding with a strange mix of nerves and satisfaction. The game was no longer mine to prove. It was theirs to lose. And they were losing beautifully. At exactly 9:00, Nina and I stepped into the largest conference room in the building, the one with the skyline view and the walnut table polished to a shine that always smelled faintly of lemon and pretense. Gavin was already at the head, tie loosened just enough to suggest false confidence. The CFO sat stiffly beside him, and across the table. 2 representatives from the acquiring firm looked up as we entered. Their faces were unreadable, but their presence alone made the air heavier. Nina didn't waste time. She placed a slim black folder in front of the buyers, then stepped back, arms folded. Inside were the documents they hadn't expected to see. My original equity grants, the 2006 amendment, and the undeniable proof that I had never signed away my rights. One of the buyers flipped through, page by page, his expression sharpening with each turn. Finally, he looked directly at Gavin. You told us you had unanimous legacy consent. Gavin cleared his throat, forced a smile. She's residual, terminated. Those shares are meaningless. That's when the older representative leaned back, almost casually, and delivered the line that sliced the room open. You made her more powerful when you fired her. The silence that followed was surgical. Gavin blinked, lost, as if the floor had just given way. The lawyer beside him shuffled papers, but no alternate reality appeared. The man continued, voice calm, absolute. By removing her operational duties, you severed her fiduciary obligation. She no longer has to act in your company's best interest. She can act solely in her own. The words hit like a verdict. I felt the shift ripple through the room. For months, I had been erased, dismissed, reduced to a footnote. Now, every pair of eyes landed on me, not as an afterthought, but as the hinge on which 150 million now swung, for the first time. I didn't feel invisible. I felt inevitable. The boardroom had gone still, the weight of silence pressing against the walnut table. Papers sat in neat stacks, but the room felt anything but orderly. Everyone was waiting for me to speak. And for once, I didn't feel the need to rush. I let them lean forward, let them wonder what I would demand. And then I laid out my terms. First, I said, steady and clear, a revised payout structure for the legacy shareholders, the ones who kept faith when this company was barely breathing. They will not be erased. I saw the CFO flinch, as if he'd forgotten anyone outside the inner circle had ever mattered. Second, I continued, sliding a page across the table, the cancellation of Gavin's golden parachute. No bonuses, no consulting contract, no soft landing. He walks out with what he came in with, nothing more. Gavin's face reddened, his jaw tightening as he gripped the edge of the table. And third, I finished, a formal board statement acknowledging my contributions and making clear that my departure was not performance-based. You will not rewrite my story for your convenience. The buyers glanced at one another, then at the board chair. No one rushed to object. No one dared. Finally, the elder representative from the acquiring firm nodded. These terms are reasonable. Gavin exploded. You can't just cave to this. She's hijacking the deal. His voice cracked, desperate, the mask slipping, but it was already over. The board chair leaned back, eyes steady on him. It's this or nothing. Gavin. The decision was made. My conditions stood. And just like that, the power he thought he owned crumbled beneath him. His money, his status, his carefully scripted narrative, all gone. I gathered my folder, rose to my feet, and looked at him one last time. My voice was calm, almost gentle. You called my 50,000 shares worthless, but they're the reason you've been rendered useless. I walked out, leaving the skyline view and lemon polish behind. No applause, no dramatics, just the quiet victory of knowing I had not only protected myself, but also spoken for every forgotten name who had been erased before me. Sometimes the strongest revenge is not rage, but dignity. And now, I'll turn it to you. What would you have done in my place? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. If this story resonated with you, tap like, share it with someone who needs the reminder. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice.